Hello, everyone. Welcome to Power of the Pod, Activism, Movement, Building, and Fundraising through Podcasting. I'm Jennifer Taylor Skinner. I am the host and the founder of the Electorate podcast, and that's a podcast that uplifts the voices of women and people from the gender non-conforming community and people from marginalized communities, activists, academics, politicians, organizers, shares their voices with the world. And also, I am the host and executive producer of a new podcast. It's a collaborative podcast with Dame Magazine called The Gatekeepers, and that looks at the history of segregation. That's coming out in a couple of weeks. So I have a couple of podcasts under my belt, and I'm glad you joined. So when I did this training last year, things were quite different in the world and in the podcast world. And one of the things I was hoping to do when I did this training last year, one of my goals at least, was to show the activism and the organizing community that podcasting was a really powerful tool to use to get out your message, right? It's a powerful media tool. And the thing that differentiates it from other media outlets is that the entry is really inexpensive and is really easy. And I was hoping to see more organizations, more activists use this platform, in contrast to what I was seeing, which was a lot of media conglomerates and a lot of corporations using it for profit, which is fine. It's totally their purview to do that. But I wanted to see more activists try to use that platform. So, fast forward a year, from then to now, I'm actually seeing that. So if you look on the screen now, here are a few podcasts I want to use as examples. All three of these podcasts were guests on my podcast at some point. And whenever I have an activist or an organizer as a guest, I'm always thinking in the back of my mind, what they're talking about would make a great podcast. They should have a podcast, right? And a lot of them have. So I'm seeing lots of organizations and nonprofits and activists actually use this platform to get their messages out, right? So just these three examples. The Lie That Binds, that is the new book. It's actually the title of the new book from Elise Hogue. She co-wrote the book about the history of the reproductive rights movement in relation to the radical right. And they have a podcast, which is, kind of going along with the book, which kind of covers that history. If you'd asked me 3 years ago or 5 years ago if it would be interesting to have a podcast with reproductive rights, I'd say yes, it'd be interesting, but will people listen? And so I'm really happy to see that people are starting podcasts about social justice issues. And the second one is a new podcast called Goat. And that one is from two activists and leaders that I admire, Andrea Haley, the president of Vote.org, and Kat Calvin, the president of Spread the Vote. They're in the voting rights space. That's a great podcast, especially now, because this is like a really crucial voting year. And the last one is Ordinary Equality. That one is hosted by Kate Kelly, and she's an activist around the Equal Rights Amendment. So this is something, not the Equal Rights Amendment, sorry, the ERA. And so this is something that I wouldn't have expected to see a few years ago. So I'm really happy that people are starting to use the podcasting platform to get social justice issues out into the world, right? So that's that. Let's see. So that's the good news. The bad news is that, anecdotally, I would have expected the pandemic would have changed things in relation to podcast listening. But a lot of data sources that I've looked at, I've been researching data sources, and shows just the opposite has happened of what I expected. So I expected, because of the pandemic, that people would be stuck indoors, everybody would be listening to podcasts. But according to several different sources, podcast listening has dipped due to the pandemic. It hasn't dipped a lot. I think it's 2 minutes of listening per person. It's dropped by 2 minutes of listening per person, which isn't a lot. But it is the first contraction that we've seen in podcasting in a while. But in contrast to that, actually the number of podcasts that are being created has increased because, again, everyone's at home, people are buying mics and they're podcasting. So those are two things. But the forecasts say that this will recover by 2021 or 2022. So this isn't necessarily discouraging for you starting a podcast, but it's just an additional data point to use when you're thinking about starting a podcast. And by the way, I just wanted to go back one bit. When I did this training last year, a lot of people at the end of it stopped me to ask questions about the technical side of podcasting. I spent a lot of time last year talking about, marketing and building your movement and activism. And at the end, I think I spent about a half an hour just answering people's questions about, uploading files and doing so, mics and equipment and things like that. So this year, I'm going to move that portion of the training to the front, and I'll try to leave a lot of time at the end so you can ask other questions that I didn't cover. So moving on. So why podcasting? So the reason that I wanted to bring this to the activism and the organizing community is, again, because there's such an ease of entry, right? You really only need a computer and a microphone and an idea or a cause, right? Unlike if you were trying to, get your own show on MSNBC to get your ideas out about, voting and voting rights, right? Podcasting is really easy. That's why there's so many of them, right? Anyone can enter, and if you have the right message, you can get your audience there. And also, additionally, it's continually rising. It's a platform that's growing, and not only is the platform itself growing in terms of the number of podcasters that are going onto the platform, but the number of listeners are steadily growing, right? So it's growing, and it's something that I think that you should try to get on the bandwagon if you have a message to get out to people. So that's one of the reasons I prefer podcasting. And we'll talk about the mic and the other equipment that you need and the range of costs that you will need to start your podcast in a bit. So one of the first things that you should decide when you've decided that you have, first you have to decide that you want a podcast. But once you've decided that, yes, I'm going to jump in, I'm going to have a podcast, the first thing that you need to decide is what format you're going to use for your podcast. And I think that this is really important because it determines a lot of things. It determines how much you'll spend, your costs, and the equipment that you'll need. It will determine your audience engagement, and I'll explain that in a minute, and how much competition you'll have, and all of those things together will determine your success, right? So some podcast formats are used more often than others, and obviously that makes those podcast formats more competitive. So think about it this way. If you have an interview style podcast, which is one of the easier types of podcasts to have, there are like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of interview style podcasts. That makes it harder for you to differentiate yourself, right? Especially in this space. And I'll talk about that. I'll just go through each format later, and I'll talk about that in relation to my own podcast, because I actually have an interview style podcast. But I'll just go through them. So the solo podcast. You see, I think the next slide will show the pros and cons, right? So the solo podcast, that is easy to enter because it's just you, right? Just you and your mic, just talking about whatever's important to you. Let's say that you are interested in teaching people about DC statehood, for instance, right? So you just get in front of your mic, and every week you talk about DC statehood. That's easy, right? You don't have to book any guests. You don't have to, coordinate with anyone else's schedule. It's just you in front of your mic, and you can just talk about it. I actually have done a few solo episodes for the electorate in the past. And I remember asking someone who was a veteran podcaster who'd done a lot of solo episodes, and I said, hey, I'm interested in doing some solo podcasting. What do you think about that? And they warned me that it was more difficult than I thought it would be, and it actually was. And the reason is because unless you're really, really good at just talking off the cuff, right? And, without a script, and, being cohesive and being interesting, it's really hard. So one of the things that I found that was really hard about it is that to have a cohesive narrative and to keep the podcast going, I had to have at least an outline or to write a script for myself, right? So that I wouldn't ramble on, kind of like what I'm doing now, right? So you need a script, or if you are lucky enough to have a budget for a writer, that's actually, quite a bit of investment. If you can do it, and you can do it and just, be cohesive and be interesting, that's another thing. Be interesting, just talking, by yourself, without guests, without another panelist, go for it, right? But for me, it's like, unless the person's really charismatic, unless they are really engaging, it's just like, when you're at a dinner party and the person next to you is kind of droning on about, the essay they wrote in college, and they're just kind of going on. So I think you really need to have your game together if you're going to do a solo podcast. But it is inexpensive because you need one mic and one computer. Now, the interview style podcast, just anecdotally, I think is probably one of the most, highly adapted formats for podcasting. Obviously, the Electorate is an interview style podcast, and I actually chose that because it was easy and the content kind of writes itself. And what I mean by that is that when I'm interviewing someone, that's the content. I ask them a question, they answer it, and there's my content. There's no scripting other than writing out a few questions. So that's easy, right? The cons for that, or the roadblocks for that, are booking guests. That's really time consuming. I don't have to do that as often now. More people come to me because, you know, they hear about the electorate and they come to me. But in the beginning, booking guests was pretty time consuming. Sending emails to everyone, trying to have enough people every week to have a new podcast. That's one. Also, you have to worry about your guest audio quality. That was a huge one for me. So when I started the electorate, I did not want to use my great mic and have my end of the podcast cast sound great, and my guests to be, you know, sound like they're talking through a tin can. So I decided early on that I was going to help my guests get better audio, and I found a headset that I use that I shipped to all of my guests, and I'll talk about the equipment later. But if that's not in your budget, or, you know, sometimes guests don't want audio equipment sent to them, that's a concern. And especially now during the pandemic, you can't have a guest go into a studio and record, right? I'm assuming that most podcast studios are probably not open, or they aren't, you know, taking as many people as they were before. So that's one thing to consider. The last thing about the interview style podcast that I'll say is that because there are so many of them, it's really, really hard to distinguish yourself, right? And here's why. So I interview people kind of in the political space and the organizing and activism space. When someone comes out with a new project or a new book, or, you know, like a new, let's say, voter registration drive, they typically have PR people who are trying to get them on to podcasts and on to television. And what ends up happening is the person that you're interviewing, let's say the week that you're going to air their interview on your podcast, they've already done like a dozen other podcasts, right? So take Stacey Abrams for instance. Everyone wants to talk to Stacey Abrams. She's amazing. She's a great podcast guest, but she's done so many podcasts because everyone wants to talk about her, talk to her, not talk about her. They want to talk about her and talk to her. But you have to be a really amazing interviewer to make that interview more engaging than the other 12 she's done earlier that week. And the way that I've worked around that in making my interviews a little more engaging than they might be otherwise is that I mix my guests up between, you know, people who are kind of, you know, selling something at the moment, or who are trying to push, you know, a specific project or a book, with people who are lesser known. For instance, I have a whole series of podcasts on the reproductive justice movement, and there are academics out there who are just, you know, for years they've been, you know, going at this thing, and they've been, you know, they've written, you know, lots of textbooks, and they have really interesting things to say, and their profiles aren't as big as Stacey Abrams, but they're really fascinating guests. So there's a good chance that I may be the only podcast they've done, you know, that year. So that kind of keeps my guest list, you know, kind of more interesting than it would be otherwise. So the third podcast platform format is the non-narrative podcast. And a good example of that would be This American Life, or Serial, or Radiolab. I like this one a lot. This is my favorite. And this is actually what I'm going to do with my collaborative podcast with Dame Magazine. So the non-fiction narrative podcast, it has a little more audio texture. You have some narration, you have some interviews, you may have some archival content. The content is a bit more engaging. It's another good example of that is the 1619 podcast, right, with New York Times. You know, the 1619 Project. That's a really excellent non-narrative podcast. If you haven't listened to that one, you should. So I think the content is the most engaging, and I think that's the biggest pro for that. The problem is that it's really difficult, right? You have to piece together all of this content. You have to piece together audio clips, you know, archival clips. You have to write out your narrative. You may have to have a script writer. You have to do interviews. You know, you have to have music and, you know, sound effects and that kind of thing. Like if you think about, I'll use 1619 as an example again. So in the opening of the 1619 podcast, you know, they're talking about, you know, I think they're standing on the shore. They're talking about, you know, the slave ships coming in. You can hear in the background, there's, I think the sound effects of an ocean. I don't actually know if they filmed, you know, on the shore, but they have a lot of sound effects and music and other audio effects, you know, interwoven into the content. And producing that can be really difficult. If you are lucky enough to have a budget where you can hire a producer, great. But just know that it's going to be more costly and just more complex. But you will get a good return on investment because those are more engaging types. The fourth one, and I put an asterisk there because I think this is really interesting, is repurposed content. If you had asked me last year or 2 years ago if I thought that this was a great format, I would say, yeah, you know, it's kind of boring. But I'm noticing that during the pandemic, a lot of people, a lot of podcasters, and a lot of media outlets are using repurposed content in a really interesting way. And I believe it's because, again, this is just my anecdotal view, that because there are so many podcasts, you know, new podcasts coming every day, you really have to kind of up your game and have more interesting content than just, you know, audio. And what I've seen a lot of people do, they'll do like a live broadcast of something on Periscope or on Facebook Live. They'll save that audio and they'll repurpose that audio for their podcast, right? And I actually like that a lot. And some really big examples are the Rachel Maddow show. So basically they just take the Rachel Maddow show and they just, you know, save the audio and publish it as a podcast. So she really only has to do that once. And previously, it was really just the big outlets that were doing that, like Readouts, which is Joanne Reed's new show, or, you know, Rachel Maddow, and I think someone else has one who has an MNCB show. I know Chris Matthews isn't there anymore, but I don't know. I'm having a brain fog. But yeah, so typically it was the big outlets that would take those shows, you know, on the big outlets, and they would repurpose that audio. And now I'm seeing smaller outlets do this. For instance, The Appeal, which is, I think, it's a podcast around criminal justice reform. They do live broadcasts on Twitter, and they repurpose that content for their podcasts. So, you know, you can do it if you're smaller, and I think that works really well. So moving on. And, you know, like I alluded to earlier, with more people podcasting and with more people kind of at home, you know, because of the pandemic, to keep your audience engaged, you really have to up your game. You know, for me, I haven't ventured out very often to anything beyond audio, but I'm realizing to compete with a lot of podcasters who are doing video and audio and who are kind of streaming in these multiple different formats, that I really need to up my game to compete. And that's it, basically. And that's a whole other podcast, right? If I do this training again next year, I will do some, I'll experiment with doing some video casts and see how that works. And I'll be able to let you know how that works for me. But I think that because of the direction we're going, you really need to have more than just audio content to reach a larger audience, if that makes sense. Let's see how we're doing on time. So your content type, this is the second decision you need to make before you launch into podcasting, okay? And what I mean by that is that, you know, is your podcast going to be timely, right? Is it going to be like, again, using Rachel Maddow, for instance, are you going to do a daily podcast or a weekly podcast, kind of catching people up on the current news, right? Or is it going to be evergreen? And evergreen, obviously, I think you know what that means. Evergreen means is your content going to be relevant a year from now or 6 months from now. When I first started the electorate, I made a decision to go for somewhere in the middle. So issues that are relevant right now, but that are evergreen, and they'll be relevant in like a year from now. So for instance, if I look back on the podcast that I did 2 years ago or 3 years ago, I did one on myths around gun violence. That's still very relevant today. And we were able to talk about some of the recent, you know, gun violence incidents that had happened, you know, within the weeks or months, you know, from the time that we did that interview. And if you were to go back and listen to that, it's still relevant, right? And I made that decision because, you know, I had a low budget, and also because I knew that when I started the podcast that I was going to have to grow my audience. So when I started it and I did those early interviews, I had a smaller audience, but the content was still really good. So I thought, you know, I want to be able to use that content a year from now and push it on social media. And so it still sounds fresh. So for me, evergreen really works. If you do a more timely podcast, I mean, obviously, I think that that's a lot of work. You have to kind of keep up with the news, and you're competing with a lot of other people who are doing the same thing. You know, again, it determines how you can monetize it. If you have a timely podcast and you're getting advertisers for your podcast, you'll really only be able to monetize that episode for the time that it's relevant. But for evergreen content, because you can listen to it a year after it was originally published, you can still kind of monetize that, right? So it determines the longevity of your episode and how long you can monetize it. And it also determines your exit strategy, right? If you're doing a podcast and it's timely and you have to update your audience every week or every day about what's happening in the news in regards to voting rights, for instance, or in regards to the Supreme Court, for instance, or whatever, or the criminal justice reform. Let's say you're just doing something and you're kind of watching current policy on something, right? You have to keep up with that, and it's really hard to take a break, right? If you want to take do kind of seasonal content and take a break from that. As opposed to evergreen content, I can actually take seasons off, right? I can have season 1, 2, and 3, and then have a gap of a couple months and come back with season 4. So you should consider that. And I think one thing I forgot to mention on the last slide was that before you start your podcast, you should really think about your exit strategy. Like, do you want to do this forever, right? I think not enough people think about that when they start a podcast. One of the formats that I've been that I like a lot is the kind of limited series podcast, and I think a lot of people are starting to realize the value of doing that. So that's, again, using 1619 as an example. I think they have something like 8 episodes, maybe 6 episodes. So you have a clear start and an end date, right? And you can monetize and sell to advertisers the entire package of your episodes, right? As opposed to saying, I'm going to go on forever and I'm going to have multiple seasons, who knows when I'm going to stop. Podcasting is really hard. It's really time consuming. It is tiring, it's a lot of work. So if let's say you have a project or kind of a short-term goal that you want to meet, make sure that you plan out your content and have an exit strategy. Say, let's say you are doing a podcast where you're covering the 2020 election. It's kind of late to do that, but let's say you did at the beginning of the year. Maybe you want to map out your content from each month leading up to the election, right? And then know that, like, okay, then my exit strategy will happen after the inauguration, and then I'll move on, right? So I don't think a lot of people think about their exit strategy, and then what you have is these podcasts that just go on, and then so they kind of peter out because again, they just kind of wear out the content that they have, so that's that. Let's go here. And I see that I have some questions coming in. I will try to leave a lot of time at the end to get to your questions. And you can ask me about the audio equipment as well in the Q&A, because I'm assuming you probably have some very specific questions. But let's talk about equipment. So, like I said, you'll need a computer, and you'll need a newer computer to support the software to record your podcast. But most importantly, you'll need a good microphone, but not too good, right? I think there's a lot of misconception about like how much you need to spend on a microphone. So I have done the research, for you, and you can do the research on your own. But I looked through lots of lists of, the best, podcasting microphones, and these are the 4 that always come up on all of the lists. And I've used 3 of these, right? So I'll share this presentation with you later, so you can, look for these yourselves and see if you like them. But the way that I decided which mic to use was, if you look at the list where they, recommend equipment, and you read through the description and you say, oh, that's kind of like what I would like. It's in my cost range. I would then go to YouTube. There are lots of audio files on YouTube who will do mic tests for you, right? They'll go through the mics and say, this is what it sounds like, and they'll do a comparison. That's how I chose my mics. I went on YouTube and I listened to a lot of people who were, kind of podcast and audio experts, and listened to them do recordings on the mic. And I would say, I like the way that sounds. It's actually a lot about personal preference, So for instance, I'll just go through these. The first one, the Audio Technica, that was recommended to me by someone who was an audiophile, like a big tech person. And he said, buy this, you can't go wrong. I bought it, and I did not like the way it sounded. I didn't like the way that it sat on my desk, and it's a nice mic, and it works for a lot of people. It did not work for me. The one that's highlighted, the Blue Yeti, I think a lot of people use that one. It's actually not that expensive. It ranges from about $99 to $150. I have actually, over the years, I've bought, I don't know, 4 or 5 of these. I know it sounds excessive, but like, when I go out of town to do a podcast, or when I'm doing something, that's really important to me, I want to have several backups. Or when I have people who do podcasts in person, don't do that now. I want to make sure I have enough mics, but I have a few of those mics around my house just to make sure that I'm never without a Blue Yeti mic. And like I said, they cost between $99 to $150. The thing about the Blue Yeti is that it comes in a lot of different colors. And, I think the cost is determined. It's just silly. I think the cost is determined on the color that you buy. I think the Blue Yeti, the actual blue color, is probably the most expensive, which is silly. I don't understand why. But that one I keep coming back to. It's not the highest, it's not the most expensive one, but it works for me. And then the other two, I think the last one, the Heil, I think that's how you pronounce it. I think they use that for it was in Pod Save America. I think that's the podcast, the microphone that they use for that one. So that one's a really expensive one. It's actually really good. I can't hear the distinction between my Blue Yeti and that one, because I think that if you remaster your audio really well, the distinctions are just so small that it doesn't really matter. And I think that the last two cost anywhere between $300 and $400. But the one thing that I want to say is the second bullet there, the mixer, which is a mixing board for your audio. You don't really need to invest in that. That's for serious audio files. If you're recording content, vocals or singing or music, and you want to mix it in, I wouldn't really worry about that, the mixer. Just for a podcast where you're just doing, interviews or, vocals or just talking. But the thing that I think is the most important, it's the third bullet, is your windscreen. I have interviewed people who, I've asked, do you want me to send you a microphone? Do you want me to send a headset? And they say, no, I have my own microphone. And they'll have like a really great microphone, but they won't have a windscreen. And that's you can see them. There's either like a mesh screen in front of your microphone, or it's something like a foam piece that you put over your microphone. All microphones sound terrible no matter how much you spend on them if you don't have a windscreen, just in my opinion. So you have to get that. The Blue Yeti comes with one, so you're fine there. But just please don't record without a windscreen. Headphones, that's just a matter of preference. I like over-the-ear headphones. I use Sennheiser for that, which is the same brand that I use for my guest headset. So this is probably the most important thing here. That I talked about in the beginning. When I decided that I wanted to do guest interviews, I decided that I wanted their audio to sound really good, right? I didn't want them to sound like they were recording in a closet or recording in, a park. So I decided to look for a microphone that was inexpensive enough that I could buy several of them and send to my guests. And so what I do is I ask them ahead of time, do you actually have a suitable headset or a microphone? And if you don't, I will send you one. So the one that I've used most often is first on the list is the Sennheiser. There are two models that I use, the PC7 and the PC8. They cost anywhere between, depending on who provides them, anywhere between $30 and about $40. And sometimes I've been able to get them for about $25. And since I don't pay my guests, this is a really decent mic. It sounds really good. I just allow them to keep it. They can keep the microphone. And so that's what I invest in each episode. I'll send them a mic. They sound great. They're happy because they have a free mic to use for the rest of their lives. And I can actually provide a link if you want a link to that one, but you can just look it up, Sennheiser PC8 or Sennheiser PC7. It has background noise cancellation. It's just a really solid mic for the price. The other two on the list I've used when the Sennheiser mics were sold out, and they have been sold out often. They actually work really well too. And I think the most important feature for these headset mics is noise cancellation, right? You can do a lot if you have good, clean audio with, background noise once background noise is canceled. So, recording and editing software. So I use number 2, Zencastr. A lot of people use Audacity, which is the first on the list. It's free. They have in-software editing. And I'm sure it works pretty well. I've never actually used it, but I think that it's probably one of the most popular ones because, again, it's free. I use Zencastr just because I like their UI. And they actually have a lot of features there that are useful if you need them. Like you can automatically add an intro or an outro, with music or vocals. And I think that's it. And they also have some post audio cleanup and editing. So when I download, when I record on Zencaster, what I'll do is I'll send a link to my guest with the Zencaster URL. We'll record on their audio recording page, and it's very similar to Skype, except it's just audio only. And what happens is it will download an audio file on each of our machines, on my guest machine and my machine, and then it will automatically upload it to the cloud. And once it's uploaded to the cloud, the software, Zencaster software, has actually done a little bit of editing and cleanup of that audio. So you get a really clean WAV file or an MP3 file dropped into your cloud, your Dropbox or whatever you're using for the cloud, once you're done with that interview. And I really like that. One of the things that they're doing now is that they are doing video podcasting. That feature is in beta, and that's something that I'm really interested in using. And the third one, Squadcast. I've used Squadcast a few times. Squadcast, I like it because they have features that Zencaster doesn't have. You can schedule your guests through Squadcast and use video editing and just do audio editing. So that's something. And a lot of people now are doing their podcast through Zoom. I actually was a guest on a podcast and they interviewed me through Zoom. I was a little skeptical about the audio quality, but it ended up sounding really good. So, if you were in a Zoom meeting, you can actually just click, record and record it, and you can download that audio, and then you can take it into your editing software and edit it. So to edit mine, I'm trying to go quickly because I want to get to your questions. To edit my audio, once I've downloaded it, I use Adobe Audition, right? That's a part of the Adobe suite. If you have, Photoshop, or if you have Illustrator, you can probably get Adobe Audition along with that suite. And the good thing about Adobe Audition is that you can also, if you decide to do video editing as well, you can edit videos in Adobe Audition. And I have a series of actions that I use to master my audio. And I won't go through that now because it takes too long to explain what I do. But I've come up with a series of remastering actions that make my audio sound really good, like how I level out the volume between, when I have more than one guest, and, make it sound really good, and, make it sound appropriate for a podcast platform when you're listening. So I will share those with you later. Actually, at the end of this presentation, I'll give you my email address, and I can send you back anything that wasn't covered here. I'll send you the list of, the equipment that I use, and the list of the links to the software that I use, and a link to some of the YouTube videos that I use for my own training. So let's see how we're doing on time. When you're ready to record, once you've decided on your platform, your equipment, and everything, the first thing you want to do before you're ready to actually start your podcast, focus on getting your trailer completed, because in order to have a spot on any of the platforms like Spotify or iTunes, you need to upload a file. And if you don't have a file to upload, you can't start a podcast, right? So let's say you've decided to do an interview style podcast and it's going to go live in a month, but you're doing interviews, right? You have your audio ready. You can take 1 minute of audio from your interview with Stacey Abrams. Let's say you land Stacey Abrams for your first interview. Just take a minute of that audio, upload that as your trailer. And one of the reasons I like to have the trailer ready well before my podcast is ready to go live is because it gives it time to go through the system. Apple, for instance, they are very quick with approving your podcast, right? It'll take, sometimes it takes a couple of weeks to get your podcast approved and uploaded. So you want to do that early. And you also want to give people time to subscribe, and it'll help you move up the ranks into your podcast. You know how they have the new and noteworthy categories of, when you open your iTunes. So get your MP3 up for your trailer as quickly as you can. Your entire episode doesn't have to be ready. You just need to take a snippet that sounds really good for your trailer. And sometimes I do that for my own podcast because obviously I have a trailer up, but now, let's say I've recorded an hour's worth of content or an hour's interview with someone, and editing that takes a while. It takes me a few hours, but I want to release like a little snippet of it. I can just cut out 30 seconds of that and share on social media without having to go through the entire episode. So that's just my tip for you. Like, get your trailer recorded and uploaded first before you do anything else. Podcast hosting. Here's a list of what I use for what's available for podcast hosting. The two that are highlighted, Megaphone and SoundCloud, are the two that I've used. Now, SoundCloud, I wouldn't recommend that. They have a lot of limitations, but it is free. And one of the things that I like, one of the features that I like, is that you can actually put a sound snippet within a tweet or within a Facebook post. You can actually post it onto social media, and when people start to listen, that counts as a download or listen. So it works really well in that sense. But SoundCloud has so many limitations in relation to monetization, etc. I wouldn't use that. All of these other ones, I won't go through each of them because there's so many. But Megaphone is the one that I use. I like it because getting advertisers and creating advertising campaigns is kind of a no-brainer with Megaphone. If you want to monetize your podcast, I would say that's probably one of the easier ones. I like the fact that they're very responsive. Their tech team is very responsive. And I'll just be honest, it costs about $99 a month. If you have an advertising agency, which I had at one point, I cut my advertising agency loose because I wanted to handle my own advertising. They will cover that cost for you, right? The problem with that is that if you have an ad agency that controls your hosting account, you won't have control over your ad placement, right? I wanted to have complete control over my ad placement, so I cut my advertising agency off. I took on the $99 cost myself, and now I have complete control over my advertising. And the reason that is important for me is because it allows me to monetize my podcast in the way that I want. It also allows me to use my ad slots to market other things other than, like Madison Reed. You've heard those Madison Reed, hair coloring kit advertisings, other than, companies. For instance, I can push people to some other project I'm working on, right? Or let's say you have an organization that works on voting rights, right? And you want people to take part in some campaign that you're doing offline, some kind of registration campaign. You can use your ad spots to push that, as opposed to selling a product for someone else. Yeah, so this is the marketing. Last thing I'll mention before I go into questions is, because I think this is really important, and I know we started late, so I'm talking really fast. I'm trying to get through as much as possible. But audiograms, those are those little snippets that you see. If you follow the electorate, I publish these every week for my episodes. It's like it's an MP4 file, which means it's a video, and it has a little audio snippet of the episode, so you can hear it, right? Those are really good. I have found that if I don't publish an audiogram for my episode, there are fewer listens. People like to hear like a little snippet of your interview or your episode before they decide to invest a full 30 minutes or a full hour into listening to the whole thing. So I found that those are really helpful. The software that I use for that is headliner.app. So you can just go to headliner.app. Again, I don't have time to really go through the details of that, but if you send me an email, I will help you. I will answer all of your questions. Let me actually just go to the questions because we are running out of time. Just got 5 minutes, right? And here's my email address, by the way, if you want to email me questions. I will answer your questions. Yeah. So let's see. I'm going to go into questions. Let's see. So Bayard says, is the decline accountable to the decline in commuting and exercising outside? That is a good question. Exercising outside. That's not my excuse, but I don't know. I've read several different accounts on, why podcasting listenership has declined. No one has an answer to that yet, and I don't know if it's because we haven't had enough time to collect that data and decide, but I just don't know. I haven't been able to figure that out. I would have thought the opposite. Anecdotally, I would have thought that there would be more people listening to podcasts. But I wouldn't really worry about it too much. It's just 2 minutes, right? But so let's see. So Becca says, our organization has a podcast with solid listener base. Good. Focus on a series and you focus on breaking news podcasts. Okay. Breaking news podcasts, are they worth doing? Well, if you have the staff to get it out quickly, right, it's worth it. But it's really hard to get things out that quickly and to compete with people who have huge staffs who will get breaking news out, before you do, right? So, once, 10 or 12 outlets have already published this breaking news, it's probably kind of stale. So, I mean, is it worth it? Can you get it out first? Because breaking news means you're, one of the first people to get it out. Great. So I guess my answer to that is no, unless you can get it out as quickly as possible, right? Think about how quickly news moves on Twitter, right? If I were trying to find out what's happening with the protests in Portland, for instance, I would not go to a podcast. I would go to Twitter first. I wouldn't even turn on the television. Twitter is faster than anything. Yeah, so I don't know. So make of that what you will. I guess I'm saying probably not, unless you can get it out faster than Twitter, maybe, or faster than, MSNBC would get that breaking news out. I don't know if you've done any. You can look at the numbers to see if your, how your listenership is for those episodes, So that's my answer to that. And if I'm not answering your question fully, please email me and I will, put more thought into it and give you a longer answer. I've seen podcasters, this is Albert. I've seen podcasters share excerpts or clips from other shows. What do you think about that in form of promotion? Does that cannibalize stats of the original podcast? You mean are they actual snippets of the podcast, or are they clipped from the podcast? Meaning, is it not going to affect the downloads from the podcast? I'm not really sure what you mean cannibalize stats of the original podcast. I think that that's a good form of promotion for if you use it, use snippets of your podcast on other podcasts or vice versa. It is a good form of promotion. I've actually done that myself. I don't think it really affects the stats, not in any kind of, I guess, useful way or valuable way. You either have a user base or you don't. Hopefully I'm answering your question. If not, email me and I'll give you a longer answer. And your second question, what's your recommendation on how to get good audio quality from your guests? And I think I answered that in the presentation. I will send them a mic. I just send them a microphone. And I send it through Amazon. It takes probably about 2 days to get there to them. And it works really well. And the one that I use, Sennheiser, if that's not available, I'll use another one. What I'll do is I'll go on YouTube and listen to examples of that one. And then I'll just decide and send it. Listen, it's always better than them just talking in their office or on their porch. If you can send them good quality headset with a mic that has a screen on the mic, or like a little phone piece on the mic that has noise cancellation, that is better than nothing. If you are really good with remastering your content, remastering your audio, your headset should work just fine. Thoughts on Libsyn? I don't really use them. I have used them, but I've been on Megaphone. I think that they have some really good features. Wow, lots of questions. I think we are, I don't know if my host is there. We're just out of time.
We are just up against, let's see, the 11:50, but you guys can go a few minutes over if you want to keep going through these questions. We'll just have a hard out at 59.
Okay, great. So just, again, my email address is jen@electorate.com with one N, and you can email me questions. Your title suggested that podcast for fundraising. How do you do this? I do fundraising and would love to add that to my social media. So I didn't really get into that very much. So what I would do, I kind of alluded to it at the end. So if I were using this for fundraising, and I've seen this done with some organizations, and I've seen this done with some not nonprofits, but for-profit companies. So when you have a podcast, especially on a platform that allows for ad campaigns, you're given a certain number of ad slots. You can have an intro ad or an outro ad or a mid-roll ad, right? You can use that to push, a company like, Daily Harvest, or you can use it for your own projects, right? So if I were running some kind of campaign or an organization and I wanted to push people to some kind of, online fundraiser, let's say you're having a DJ party on Instagram, right? you can use your ad spots to push that and to push people towards that other thing, right? Or if you are having some, and it's hard to do this kind of during a pandemic because everything is virtual, right? But if let's say we weren't in a pandemic and everything wasn't virtual, you can use that to, you know, push your other, let's say you're having a fundraising event in your town, right? That's just another outlet to reach all of your guests during all of your episodes. So for instance, if you have, you know, 12 episodes up and, you know, you've got, you know, 5,000 people listening to those episodes at a given time, you can use your ad slots. You can use all three of them if you want, you know, your mid-roll, your intro and your outro, to drive people to your other projects. There's actually someone who does this really, really well. She's actually a for-profit, and you know, she makes lots of money. and I'm hesitant to mention this because it's not a nonprofit. This is actually going in her own pockets. But she almost never, she has millions of listeners, and she almost never uses her ad slots for advertisers, like outside advertisers. She always uses her ad slots to push to other projects because they have more value to her, right? So if she's doing, you know, she's doing a book reading or she's doing something else, she'll push her readers using her ad slots to her other project, if that makes sense. Hopefully I'm making sense. But that's how I think you can use it for fundraising, right? Yeah, because I think that the podcast market is so overcrowded right now. It's really hard to get a really good return on investment via ad revenue, right? Unless you have millions and millions of users, you can compete with, you know, the what is it, Pod something America, Pod Tip America. It's probably more valuable to send them to other projects, if that makes sense. In the beginning phases, this is Emmanuel. Do you recommend a Mac or Windows? I have always used Windows. That's it. I've always used Windows. I've used Macs before. My husband has a Mac, but I use Windows, and I don't recommend one or the other. I think that the software that is available for podcasting and for remastering works fine for both.
I apologize for interrupting. I just wanted to jump in to say, since this panel started late due to technical issues, you are welcome to go over the 1 o'clock time if you would like to keep answering questions. And of course, if you have your own personal app, that's no problem. Also, I'll just say, in my own experience recording and editing podcasts, that Macs work great. GarageBand is a free software that's very user-friendly, and you can do some actually pretty complex editing on there if you have multiple tracks, if you want to do something more complicated like the 1619 project. I would recommend it personally, but Windows works great too.
Thank you very much. There you go. Answer my question. Yeah, I haven't actually used it. I do know that, yeah, I haven't actually used it, but he's right. Let's see. How exactly are you connecting with your interviewee? This is Allison. We're using Zoom. What is the vehicle through which you connect with your guests? I use Zencastr, and I also use Squadcast, but Zencastr actually allows you to have multiple guests on at the same time. They're actually doing a beta of a video feature. I like Zencastr versus Zoom, because Zoom was intended for meetings, right? It wasn't intended for podcasts. I like Zencastr versus Zoom because it has a lot of audio features. Like I said, you can add an intro or an outro. It actually does some cleanup of your audio for you. It's created and it's updated. I mean, they do the actual software updates with podcasting in mind. And I think Zoom, the software is created with meetings in mind, right? Like doing meetings. So how I connect with my guests is that I will create, let's say, you know, Allison, you're on my podcast. I would create a unique room for us, and I would title it zencastr.com/electorat/Allison. I would send that link to you. You would connect. We'd end up in the same audio room, right? And then we would just record. I would just click record, and we were there. We could talk like we're on the phone. We could chat with each other. And I send that to all of my interviewees, and it works really well. I have not used their beta video feature, but it would probably work similarly, except you'd be able to see video and it would record that. I have to say this though, it's kind of hesitant to say it, but sometimes Zencastr, I think that they're great for podcasting. I have had a few problems with them, you know, over the past year. I probably say like every 3 months it's down, or every couple of months, you know, they'll be down, and you know, during the middle of an interview. And their help people, or their small team, they are really responsive, but their UI is just really, really good, and it's just really clean and easy to use. Hopefully I answered that question. And see, I'm going through to see if there's anything else that I have not answered. Yeah, so hopefully I've answered all of your questions. I feel like Albert's question about like the cannibalizing stats of original podcasts, I didn't really get to that one. But again, email me at jen@electorate.com if you have additional questions. I am happy to answer them. And I wish you well in podcasting. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. We appreciate your time. I'm going to go ahead and end the session now. Y'all have a
Thank
great
you very much.
day for the rest of your meetings.